Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for being here. A couple of thank yous just at the beginning. First of all, I can't believe the desserts. The pumpkin pie that someone bought was good, but then, before then, there was this pumpkin squares. Who brought those? Oh, to die for. Man, if I weren't married, wow. Yeah, golly. Just kidding, Hilda. So, it's wonderful to have you all here. There is one person that I just want to introduce, and it's Jessie Jimison. Jessie, if you'd just stand for a second, please. Jessie is a wonderful friend of mine. She is a nurse practitioner, and she is a member of the Veterans Education Project that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. She really is a Vietnam veteran because her dad, Gordon Fletcher Howell, one of my best friends, was a member of our group, and he died some years ago. Jess, loving her mom and dad, but also the recipient of the stuff that her dad brought back with him from Vietnam, which makes her a veteran as well. So, Jess, thanks for being here tonight. Well, I normally give this presentation to 10th graders. So I'll sort of, Jerry, by the way, said that that worked for him. So so I'll go back and forth talking about treating you as adults, but then saying, well, let's pretend we're 10th graders. I'm going to start with a little introduction, then I'm going to ask you 4 questions, then I'm going to tell my story, and then open for anything you'd like to talk about. Also, this is not a lecture, so feel free at any moment to raise your hand to make any comments that you'd like. The introduction is that in the early 1980s, I moved to Northampton to be the rector of St. John's there. And maybe it was 82 or 83, I don't know exactly. One day, a helicopter landed in the playing fields outside a local high school. And out of the Army helicopter jumped a bunch of soldiers dressed up in combat gear, and on the playing field demonstrated some fighting techniques, then went into the auditorium and did an all-school assembly showing weapons and talking about the military, and then passing out recruitment brochures. And a local Vietnam vet read about that happening and said to himself, I would love to go talk with those same students to simply tell my story of my experience, what it was actually like for me in Vietnam, to give them a little balance to the recruiters who need to meet their quota every month, and to have a little balance. He said, it's a little bit like if I was in charge of promoting a cereal. And it tasted incredibly wonderful. And the only thing is that 1 out of 100 who ate it died. So I want to be excited about the cereal, but I probably also ought to let them know that little statistic. So that one veteran started to gather together around him slowly other Vietnam veterans, and I joined them. And we spent about 6 months talking together about how we might go into schools and other venues to tell our story. So at its height, the Veterans Education Project, based in Amherst, had 15 or 20 speakers, and we did 150 presentations a year in high schools, private and public schools, colleges, churches, synagogues, jails, juvenile lockups, all over the place. Today, we're down really to 2 vets. And we could talk more about that, but for everything there's a season, and the season for Vietnam vets telling their story is starting to draw to a close. So that's a little bit of the background to why I'm here and why Jessie's here. Now the questions. And this is what I would ask 10th graders. Raise your hand if you know somebody who fought in Vietnam. Okay, put your hands down, thank you. When I ask that today of 10th graders, there's 1 or 2 hands. It used to be my uncle, my cousin, my father. then it was grandfather, and now I'm even getting great-grandfather. So lots of you know someone who fought in Vietnam, and in fact, I know some of you, at least one of you, were also a veteran, fought in Vietnam. Second question, what were some of the hands that went up? Okay, Jan, can I ask who?
Someone I loved. He didn't make it.
He was killed in Vietnam?
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Another hand? Yes, Pete?
Brother.
Your brother?
Yep.
Okay. Let me ask you, does he talk about his experience?
No longer. He died about 2 years after getting back from Vietnam. He was in DMZ, and we think Agent Orange is what got him.
Okay.
Not right away, but eventually.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Tom Harrelson, whose father, well, Tom was in Vietnam, was a ranger. His father's name was on the flagpole here at St. Andrews.
Uh-huh. Did Tom talk about his experience there?
No, never did.
Never did.
talked.
A couple other hands. Sue.
Mine is relevant. My ex-husband, who's an ex-husband twice now, and he has never talked about it.
And he's never talked about it. A couple other hands. Jerry.
I served in the active duty Army and National Guard with a number of pilots, flew there, and most of them would share some, but
Okay.
not everything.
Yep.
It was my uncle and my brother, and no, they did not talk about it. My uncle got a purple heart, but wouldn't talk about it.
Let's do just one more. Mike.
When I was in the Air Force, there was a couple pilots that were actually POWs.
Okay. So, as I asked this question over 40 years of speaking in classes, 4 out of 5 of the people that they knew who fought in Vietnam say they've never talked about it. Why is the question. So let me pose that question in a slightly different way. And again, this is what I would do with 10th graders. So let's say, so today is November 12, I believe, and it's about 10 past 7, November 12, 2024. Let's say that in this room, in the next hour, something huge happens. Won't say what it is, could be anything, but something really significant. Now, let's jump 50 years from now. It's been 50 plus years since Vietnam. Let's go 50 years in the future, which if you're in 10th grade, this is going to work. So, it is now 2074. It's now 2074, November 12th at 10 past 7 in the evening. What's happened to all of you, 10th graders? Well, you've all graduated from high school, you've all gone on to college, you all have gotten a job making a couple $1 million a year, you all either have a spouse or a partner, and you've all got 2.5 kids, national average. And in all that time, with all of that happening to you, you've not once said anything to anybody about what happened to you in this room in the next hour. The question is not to answer, but to think about what could happen to you here in the next hour that would so affect you that you wouldn't say anything to anybody about it for the next 50 years. The third question is, raise your hand if you've been to the Vietnam Wall. Wow. Okay, thank you. Hardly any kids have, so I always bring this and show it to them. And this is a painting that I'm sure a lot of you know, but let me just say a word about it. As you can see, there's a fella who's visiting the Vietnam Wall. And the only thing that's not accurate about this painting is that the wall's higher than is shown here. But he's got his hand up, touching the wall, and from inside the wall, a soldier is touching his hand, representing a name on the wall. And the guy visiting has his jacket off and the briefcase by his side, on his way home from work, perhaps. And behind the guy in the wall, there's some others in the background. I'd say one is white, one is black, one is tan, maybe way in the back, one is a woman representing everybody who'd been in Vietnam. And the guy visiting is crying. And what I want to say is that in a counterintuitive way, he is at this moment experiencing a healing. Because I have a friend, Jess and I have a friend who fought in Vietnam and for years refused to go to the wall because he was afraid that if he went and saw names of friends, it would trigger stuff in him that he'd been keeping outside and he'd lose it. And finally, a few years ago, he got up the courage to go. And it happened just as he was afraid. He completely fell apart and broke down and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. The thing is, today, he counts that moment at the wall as the first day for real healing to take place in his life. So, here's the last question, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my story. Be thinking of some movie you've seen about war, and ask yourself, do I think that movie was realistic or not? And toward the end, if we've got time, I'll just ask you about some movie you might be thinking of and ask you whether you think it was realistic or not. Okay? So let me now just tell you my story. And it's only my story. And John, who's a Vietnam vet, would have a totally different story. Anybody else in Vietnam besides John here tonight? Okay, so it's John and me. But any Vietnam vet would have their own story. Gordon certainly had his. So my story is that I did 1 year of college, and it was a disaster. I went to Williams. Calculus just killed me. In the spring term, the night before the final, I went into a friend's room with a bottle of wine and we got kind of drunk and then took, it's interesting to take a calculus final a little bit tipsy. I remember at one point leaning over and asking him a question during the exam and the two of us just cracking up. And I got a D- as a gift. But at that time in my life, there was a book called On the Road by Jack Kerouac that I know some of you know. And for me, it was my Bible. Jack Kerouac, getting on the road, represented everything that I wanted to do. I'd look out the window of the classroom and think, what's going on in here is not real life. Real life is out there and I just want to go. Plus, I'd played soccer, hockey, and lacrosse in high school and college, and I'd taken Outward Bound and climbed mountains, so all of that part of my life was exciting too. So somehow, I equated Jack Kerouac's On the Road with the United States Marine Corps. Makes no sense, but I connected it.
How did you do that?
So, in the summer of 1967, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. And at that time, they were offering 2-year enlistments, and Williams College said I could have a 2-year leave of absence, and so I enlisted. I didn't enlist to protect democracy. I didn't enlist because I wanted to go to Vietnam and fight. I just was sick of school and wanted to have something exciting and a challenge in my life. That's all it was. You know, and I was young and I was a guy. So in July of 1967, on a given day, I took a train from the South Station in Boston down to Charleston, South Carolina, and then got on a bus with 50 other guys and arrived at Parris Island at midnight. And Parris Island, you know, is where there's boot camp for the Marine Corps. The bus pulled up on a hot July night at midnight in front of a building with a sign over the door that said, "Through these portals pass recruits for the greatest fighting machine in the world." And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's cool, okay. Out of the door walked the drill instructor. He looked just like drill instructors do in the movies. I mean, 20 feet tall, shoulders 12 feet wide, gold gym body, and he had that green Smokey the Bear hat tilted down over his eyes. And he got on the bus. And he said to us, "Welcome to Parris Island. If you are chewing a gum, you will swallow it. If you are smoking a cigarette, you'll extinguish it. You got 3 seconds to get off this bus and 2 of them are up. Now move." And he got off the bus. The first guy in the front seat jumped up and ran down the steps, and the drill instructor hit him in the face with his fist. The guy fell on the ground. I looked out the window and saw blood coming out of his nose and thought to myself for the first time, I'm not sure. So we all ran off the bus, and there were yellow footprints painted in the ground, and we put our feet in those footprints, which got us in 4 columns. Now, is there some guy who would volunteer to come up here with me? Okay.
In the Air Force, if you volunteer.
Okay, I'm going to show you what that one drill instructor did to me. So, I'm the drill instructor. Bill is me. It would have been the other way. So, face me, stand at attention. Actually, that's not bad. Okay, so stomach in. Okay, good.
That's all it does.
So, the drill instructor came up to me, and first of all, he got his nose, and this is not an exaggeration, he got his nose 1/2 inch away from mine. I won't get that close. Then, he started screaming at me, and I won't scream at you. And as he screamed, I mean, I knew a lot of swear words, but in his screaming, I learned a whole new vocabulary. And as he screamed at me, I realized not only was spit coming out of his mouth, but he had a chaw of tobacco in his mouth. So, and not for 5 seconds, but like for a full minute, this fire hose of spit and tobacco juice hit my face and trickled down my front. And I just stood there. Why didn't I do something?
Because you were smart.
Do you see that within 30 seconds, they had already begun to instill in me the basic truth of boot camp, which is whatever else is going on, I'm not going to stay in this island 1 second longer than I have to. And the process began of Jim Monroe disappearing and being replaced by Recruit Monroe, who would answer and obey any command that he was given. Thank you, William. Thank you, sir. So, after that, about 4 or 5 drill instructors appeared out of nowhere, screaming and yelling, and marched us off to a barracks, except that we didn't know how to march, so we stumbled along. And we all got in, there were about 50 of us. We got into a room about the size of from those curtains to those curtains there. And when we got there, we all had to stand at attention against a wall all around. And as we stood at attention, one drill instructor said, "Ready, strip." And we all had to take off all our clothes and stand there naked. Nothing makes you feel more vulnerable and weak than being totally naked at 1 o'clock in the morning on a hot July night with guys screaming at you. Then they said, "Don't move," and they left. And we just stood there for 3 hours. And I remember one guy fainted, and we just let him lie there. And then they came back at, I don't know, about 4 o'clock or so, screaming and yelling, told us to get our clothes on, and herded us off to have breakfast. And that was the beginning of boot camp. It had been 13 weeks, but so many guys were getting killed in Vietnam that they shortened it. I think it was seven weeks. Lots of stories that I could tell about boot camp. Let me just a couple, and then we'll move on. The way we got into bed at night was to be to stand at attention beside our bunk, where there was a double bunk, and a drill instructor would say, "Ready, mount!" And we'd leap into bed and lie at attention on our back. And we'd do that 50 or 75 times, until finally he'd say, "Ready, sleep." And the way we got up in the morning was they'd come down the aisle at 4 or 5 in the morning, rolling trash cans and knocking over the bunks. And the second we woke up, we had to be running in place at the foot of our bunks. And if we were really good, they'd let us go to the bathroom for the first time 2 or 3 hours later. So that was boot camp. We were supposed to have 10 free minutes a day, but we never saw that. I remember one of our, and you know, this was like 55 plus years ago, I still remember the names of my 3 drill instructors. Staff Sergeant Jablonski, Staff Sergeant Usselton, and Sergeant Bennett. And Sergeant Bennett on the second day was going to teach us how to make our bunks, and he had a lesson plan, and he couldn't read it. So he just threw it down and then showed us. And I thought, my drill instructor doesn't know how to read. Anyway, so boot camp went on for 7 weeks. I didn't once say a single word to anybody for 7 weeks except with 50 other guys saying yes, sir, or no, sir. I did love close order drill. That was really quite amazing to have 50 guys all marching in step and moving the rifles back and forth. That was kind of like dancing. Anyway, boot camp ended. And then they sent me out to California to Camp Pendleton, where I was trained to be a fire direction control, not officer, but a person for firing 105 howitzers, those big long cannons. And so that was a school for, a couple of months. I remember I was there for Christmas. And I remember on Christmas morning, my parents had sent me some packages, and I got up and I went into the bathroom and sort of sat on the floor in the bathroom to open up the presents, which was a slightly different kind of Christmas morning. The school ended, and I was getting ready to go to Vietnam. I'd also, I won't even tell that, a whole nother story. We had a field problem in Camp Pendleton, and I got poison ivy in a way that you shouldn't get poison ivy, but that's another story. At the last minute, they changed my orders, and they sent me to 29 Palms, which is a Marine Corps base in Southern California, way out in the desert. The living part's small, but it's huge. It's the biggest Marine Corps base because it's where they test and they work on missiles and rockets and cannons. And I was assigned to learn how to fire a red-eye missile. And a red-eye missile looked like a bazooka. It sat on your shoulder, and it fired a little two-stage rocket that would shoot down planes sort of close in, within a mile or two. And so for almost a year, that's what I did in the desert, practice firing red-eye missiles. Now, there weren't any enemy planes really in Vietnam of any sort whatsoever, so we were not going to go over to Vietnam. So in November of 1968, I went to my commanding officer and told him that I wanted to go to Vietnam. I was getting out the following June. I knew I wouldn't be killed. I knew I wouldn't be injured. I knew I wouldn't be afraid. I knew that I would see exciting stuff and come home and write the next great novel about war. Which is to say, with all of that Marine Corps training, I still had no sense of the reality of things. In fact, I never really understand the reality of things until I experience them in all areas of life. Like preaching. But no, that's another thing. So I went home and was home for Thanksgiving in the beginning of December. And then I remember my mom and dad driving me to Logan Airport and saying goodbye. And I had no understanding at that moment what they were going through. Because they were just sort of, okay, God bless you, we'll pray for you, see you in 6 or 7 months. I had no sense of what they probably were actually going through. And I flew out to California, to El Toro. It was Camp Pendleton for 3 weeks of staging. And staging was the training that Marines went through to get ready for Vietnam. And it was silly. We'd walk down trails that were booby-trapped, but it was just fun. And we'd sort of get mines out and defuse them, but it was sort of fun. And we'd attack hills and throw smoke grenades. But it was fun. A sense of what was actually going to be like wasn't happening. So I flew to Vietnam. We flew, first of all, to Okinawa. And I was in Okinawa for a week. And on Okinawa, during that week, I was transferred to 3 different bases. And there was a movie that followed me at each one of the bases. And it was, what's the Walt Disney movie about the Volkswagen way back there? What? Love Bug, yes. You remember the name of the Volkswagen? Herbie. And so when I got to Vietnam and I told them that, from then on, my nickname was Herbie in the Marine Corps from then on. So I landed then in Da Nang, in the northern part of South Vietnam, and went to my assignment, which was a fire direction unit. And the unit was not way out in the jungle, but it wasn't in the city, kind of in between. And this particular unit, we were on a small hill, about a quarter of a mile wide, a half mile long, concertina wire all around it, you know, that barbed wire this encircles with razor blades, and foxholes all around, and then buildings in the middle with sandbags around them. And let me explain to you what I did as a job. So let's say, Pat, that you are a forward observer, and you're out in the field and you see some North Vietnamese soldiers. So you call me up, and I'm maybe 10 miles here in this underground bunker where we're stationed, and you give me the map coordinates. I take those coordinates and put them into a computer called FADAC. 1969, January and February, it's only got about 4 buttons, but it was a computer. And I would change the numbers around. And then I'd get on the phone and I'd call over here to Karen, who is in charge of a 105 howitzer, those huge cannons that fire big shells like that. And I would give her numbers that you could understand for aiming the cannon. And you'd fire one shell, and it'd go 15 or 20 miles over here and land. And Pat would see that it's got to go 50 yards this way and 100 yards this way to land in the middle of the soldiers. Call me up with slightly different coordinates, change them around, call you up with slightly different aiming, you fire a shell. This time it lands in the middle of the soldiers. You call me up and say fire for effect. I call you and say fire for effect, and you shoot a bunch of shells. So that's what I did for 2 months, working 6 hours on and 12 hours off around the clock. So you see, I never saw or heard anything that happened over here. And I never saw or heard anything that happened over there, but I was involved in getting bodies blown apart over there. Also, we did H&I fire, which stands for harassment and interdiction. Somebody on high would tell us that there's some place out there where it's safe just to shoot the howitzer because there weren't any civilians there, but there might be troops, and so it's to keep them down. Of course, I mean, it wasn't true, you know, that they just went anywhere, and who knows what they did. There was a cartoon in Doonesbury during the war. Doonesbury started during the Vietnam War. And in it, it shows 2 pilots of a B-52 bomber. They're dropping those huge 500-pound bombs in Vietnam that make them monster craters. And in the cartoon, one pilot says to the other, "Hey, did you hear? The Knicks won by 2 last night." The point being that these 2 guys are talking about a basketball game back in the world with no experience of what their bombs are doing on the ground. And that was my experience as well. Until February 23, 1969. And that's really why I'm here tonight. Because February 23, 1969, in a way, has defined my life in many, many ways since then. So I want to tell you about it. Let me just say, we're going to conclude with talking about healing. But first of all, so I was asleep. I was sleeping in what's called a hooch. And a hooch was a wooden building with a tin roof that slept about 10 or 12 guys on canvas cots. And we had mosquito netting over our cots because it was really hot in February and there were rats and mice that the mosquito netting kept off. So I went to sleep at about midnight and woke up 2 hours later at 2 a.m. to explosions. And I'd never heard explosions. I had heard them off in the distance, but never right there. I looked up and a little corner of the hooch was gone. And I remember thinking, wow, how'd that happen? By the way, when I got home that summer, my dad said, "Why don't you sit down, Jim, and type up every single memory of that night that you've got?" And I'm glad he had me do that, because every now and then I read them again, because over time it can fade. When I read them recently, I read that when I was lying in that cot, I was excited. and started laughing and saying to myself, this is so great. Now I get to see what it's like. So I decided I better get up. So I rolled off the cot and I got all tangled up in the mosquito netting lying on the floor. And I remember lying there and laughing and thinking, I don't remember the hero sort of getting tangled up in mosquito netting. So I got untangled. It was really hot there, so I was just sleeping in my shorts and a t-shirt, so I gathered all my gear in my arms and walked outside. Explosions everywhere, but I had no idea what was going on. So I walked up to one foxhole that was along the perimeter, and in it were 4 or 5 of my friends. And I looked down and said, hi guys, and they said, hi Jim. And then they said, we're kind of full, why don't you go down to the next foxhole? So I said, okay, see you later, and walked on, having no idea that within the next hour, 2 of them in that foxhole would be dead. And I got to the next foxhole, and I got in. And when I got in, I put on all my gear. And when I got everything on, I realized, this is a little embarrassing, I forgot 2 things back at the hooch. First of all, I forgot my rifle. I forgot. One thing, every night at boot camp, they made us kneel and pray. But it wasn't a prayer to God, it was a prayer to our rifle. It was something like, dear God, dear rifle, I love you. Dear rifle, I'll never leave you. I can't remember the rest of it. And I'd left my rifle in the hooch. The other thing I'd forgotten, and don't remember ever seeing heroes forgetting this in the movie, I left my pants behind. I forgot my trousers. So there I am in the foxhole with the helmet, flak jacket, and boots, feeling kind of stupid. And so I knelt down. This foxhole was about this deep with sandbags all around it, maybe just this wide, but kind of long from me to the front row. And I knelt down in one corner, and there was one other guy in it. His name was William Yashkinitz. He had been in Vietnam for 13 months, which was how long your tour was if you were a Marine. Army, it was 12. Marines, it was 13. And then he'd gone home. And in Vietnam, you never had to come back for a second tour, unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, where, you know, we know some people have had 2 or 3 tours. But he had volunteered because the Marines had said to him, if you come back, we'll give you a lot of money and choice of duty station and all that. So he'd come back just a couple weeks earlier. He was 18. He'd just gotten engaged to be married. So William was right there. So I don't know how long I crouched in that corner of the foxhole. Half hour, 45 minutes, maybe less, maybe more. Explosions everywhere. I was hearing grenades going off. I was hearing machine gun fire. There were mortars being shot in the air that were flares. So they go way up and then they'd pop and they'd come down with a little parachute making weird flickering lights in the sky. I remember that there were trillions of little bits of paper floating in the air and I didn't know why. I heard guys yelling everywhere, but I didn't know what had happened. What I learned afterwards, what did happen, is that this was the post-Tet Offensive of 1969. Remember in 1968, the Tet Offensive, and 69 they got ready for another Tet Offensive. It didn't happen, and after Tet they relaxed, and then there was a post-Tet Offensive. Not quite as big as 68, but still big, and cities all across South Vietnam were hit. And in our unit, some North Vietnamese soldiers had come across some rice paddies and lined up all along our perimeter and at a given moment started attacking. Further down, there had been some sappers. And sappers are people who strap dynamite onto their bodies and blow themselves up. And so some of the North Vietnamese soldiers, they'd get high and they'd throw their bodies onto the wire, blow themselves up to make a hole. Others would run and stand in the middle of hooches and blow themselves up. Where I was, they were just lined up outside the barbed wire and throwing grenades and shooting. I didn't know that at the time. All I heard was this craziness. As I sat in the hole, some of the explosions were really close and started to kick dirt into the hole. And then I got to start to get afraid, starting to get a little bit nervous. And I don't know how long it was. Let me just come here. But at one point, as I was crouched in the hole like this, there was an explosion in front of me in the foxhole. I later learned that it was a grenade that a North Vietnamese soldier had thrown into the foxhole. But this is the point where I don't have words to adequately communicate what that moment, that experience was like. First of all, the explosion was so loud that I didn't hear anything. It was louder than sound. It blew my eardrums apart, so punctured both eardrums. As I'm talking to you now, I can hear my ears ringing. They've rung 7/24 since January 23, 1969. I'm totally used to it, so it doesn't bother me anymore, and I'll forget it now in 30 seconds when I move on to something else, but it blew my eardrums apart. Also, I didn't feel any pain. Sometimes when you get an electric shock, with a light bulb or something, you don't actually feel pain. But you also know that something really bad has happened that you don't want to have happen to you again. So I didn't feel any pain. What I did feel was a force hitting me that I didn't imagine existed. A force that hit me and went through me. Went through my body, went through my spirit, and I had absolutely no way to protect myself in any way whatsoever. I'm trying to think of analogies. An anvil where you pound a horseshoe. Imagine putting your head beside the anvil so that your ear is that far from the anvil, and then me taking a sledgehammer and pounding it on the anvil right by your ear so that nothing touches you. But what would happen to that sound going into your head at that moment? The other analogy that came to me was of a naked little baby lying on a beach with a tidal wave coming toward the baby. And the baby can't do anything. All it can do is just lie there, and that wave can do anything with it that it wants. So that was my experience of this force that I can't describe hitting me. And so in that moment, I learned something. I didn't know consciously that I had learned it for years, but I did learn it in my spirit. And what I learned was that experience of being that vulnerable to something that awful was so overwhelming that I would make sure for the rest of my life that I never would be vulnerable to being hurt like that again. And anybody who's ever been in combat comes home with that experience, without exception. And it could be just a little big learning, or it could be a huge learning. But that's the learning. So what we do when we come home is to build walls so that we can be safe behind the walls, so that that thing can't come over and hurt us. The best wall of all, tragically, of course, is taking your own life. That guarantees that you're not going to be vulnerable anymore to being hurt. And I don't have the right exact numbers, but the statistics for Vietnam vets, even to this day, taking their own lives, is a lot higher than for the general population. But there are other walls that work. Alcohol can be a really good wall that you can hide behind. Drugs can be a really good wall. The only problem, of course, is that behind that wall, you're all by yourself. So the wall that I built, and again, I didn't know I built it at the time, but I did, was the wall of having a lot of friends, which kind of works out well if you're an Episcopal priest, as a substitute for letting any one person come over the wall and get really close and be dangerous. Some of you know Len Cowan, who's an Episcopal priest. He's a dear friend of mine. He's retired now. And he had a wonderful long marriage, but before he got married, he told me he had a girlfriend who at one point came to him and said, "We got to break up because you now know me so well that you've got the power to hurt me, and I can't live with that possibility. So we got to break up." So as a result of my having that wall, among other things, I got engaged to be married 3 times, and each time headed for the hills when she started to get close as the wedding day would approach. And 3 times that was a terrible, terrible thing to do to those young women. I did it to girlfriends also. A little hint about healing that I want to get to in about 10 minutes is that about 15 years ago now, one particular young woman very, very slowly started to come over my wall. And thanks to her being incredible, thanks to a great shrink, thanks to the right circumstances, and thanks to a gracious God, she came all the way over, and we got married 6.5 years ago. And so now I'm really screwed because, I mean, if Hilda dies, my world completely falls apart. It would have been a lot safer if I could just be all alone. So that's what I learned, even though I didn't know it, in the explosion. So let me come back now. When I sort of got conscious, it didn't knock me out, but I just took a little while to, whoa, and I remember checking my arms, they were bleeding, and I wondered what was going on. I looked over at William Yashkinitz, and he had some blood coming out of the corner of his eye. So I started to stand up to help him. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I got up sort of like about this far, and he was over here. And for just 1/10 of a second, literally a split second, I saw something floating out of the corner of my right eye. And then it exploded. And that was a second grenade, thrown presumably by the same North Vietnamese soldier. And I didn't know it at the time, but it killed William Yashkinitz. And if there's time, maybe in a few minutes I can tell you about a phone call I had with his brother years and years later. All I knew at that moment was that I really was going into shock. And so I lay down on the floor of the foxhole and in shock started, those of you, to the 10th graders, I say, you all are pretty young, but it's perfectly possible that you've also had some grenades because they come in all different forms. And I get that. But in shock, you start, everything sort of distances. So I would lay there on the floor of the foxhole, and I said, oh, I remember, they used to play dead, I'll do that. And then I thought, oh, my poor mom and dad, oh, sorry, they're going to be sad. And I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually somebody yelled that it was safe to get out of the foxhole, that they'd pushed back the North Vietnamese soldiers. And I crawled out of the foxhole, and there, right at the lip, was a dead Marine. And I'd never seen a dead person before, with a huge pool of blood around his head. I'd never seen that much blood ever before. But I was in shock, so it's like, oh, there's a dead person. Somebody took me, well, it began a little series. They took me to a bunker, then they put me in a truck, then I went to a medevac unit, then they flew me in a helicopter to the Naval Hospital in Da Nang. And I was there for about 2 weeks. And the second day I was in the hospital, as the shock was sort of wearing off, I became afraid. And I was not prepared for being afraid. I had no idea how powerful the fear of terror is. The cartoons, sometimes if somebody's afraid, you can see their heart sort of, beating like that. I felt my heart hitting my ribs and beating 24/7. Along with the fear, then came another emotion that I was completely unprepared for, and that was shame. I was ashamed of being afraid. And shame is a terrible emotion. It is so crippling to the spirit. So I was there for 2 weeks, and they were waiting for my ears to stop bleeding to fly me to another hospital. My wounds were the punctured eardrums, a fractured skull, and shrapnel holes. No really huge ones, but all up and down the body, bits of shrapnel. Finally, after 2 weeks, they flew me to a hospital in Japan. And I remember the moment that that plane left the ground in Da Nang was the first moment that I felt safe. And to this day, I can remember the feeling of being able to relax a little bit. So I was in Japan for 2 weeks, and I was with, in the same room, a friend of mine named Willie Roe Yates from Georgia, whose leg had been shot right beside me, or next to me. And he was in the same room. I remember one day they came in to give him some blood. And they got it all hooked up and walked out, and 30 seconds later he started screaming. And I looked over and his body was suddenly covered with red spots because it was the wrong blood. And they came running in and yanked it out and did whatever they did, and then he was okay. And Willie Roe Yates is the one friend really that I had for years after Vietnam. You know, after World War II, you trained together, you went over in a ship together, you fought together, you came back in the ship together, and then you went to a World War II club or a VFW, and you had these lifelong friends. Not like that in Vietnam. You know, I trained with one group, flew over with another group, was with some others, came back all by myself. So there's no Vietnam clubs the way there are, like World War II clubs. So after 2 weeks, I didn't know what they were going to do with me. And I thought to myself, if they're going to send me back to Vietnam, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then he came in one day and said, you need more, so we're going to send you back to the States. So I was flown back to Chelsea Naval Hospital in Boston, and I was there for 2 months. And after a month, I got up every morning and went out and gave tickets to cars in the parking lot. That was my job. And when that 2 months was up, I went to Chelsea Naval Shipyard. I was there for a month. And then I had about a month to go before my enlistment was over. And they didn't want to send me back just for a month, so I got out a month early. And I remember going to some office in South Boston, walking in all by myself, going up to some desk. Somebody had a little stamp and stamped a piece of paper, walked out of the office, outdoors, all by myself, and thought, well, okay, that's over. Now I'll go back to school. Having no idea that it really would take a long time to really start dealing with the effects of what happened to me. Yeah?
And you were how old at this point?
I was a little older. I think I was 22 at this point. Yeah. They were calling me granddad at 22. So let me now just say a little word about PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder. I would just as soon drop the D. I don't think it's a disorder to have stress after trauma. But anyway. So just a couple of examples of PTSD, and I know a lot of you know all about it, maybe more than me. For instance, when I got back to Williams that fall to start my sophomore year, I'd get in bed at night, and lying in bed, I would think to myself, maybe at this moment the plane is flying over Boston. And maybe at this moment the plane has dropped the bomb. And maybe in 30 seconds, the bomb is going to explode. And what am I going to do? And then my head would say, Jim, there's no bomb, there's no plane. But my head didn't have the ability to go down to wherever it was in my gut that fear existed to turn it off. So for a couple of years at Williams, every night when I'd get into bed, my heart would beat a little faster as I fell asleep. One little PTSD example. Just one more. I have a friend who fought in Iraq, and he came home and came up to me one day in tears to say that he was going to lose his driver's license. And when I asked him why, he said he'd just been in a traffic jam in downtown Springfield and had roared out of there with his car, and a cop had come after him and given him a ticket for speeding. And he told me that he had learned through experience that if you were in a vehicle in downtown Baghdad and there was a big congestion, that it was super dangerous and you had to get out of there pronto. And so he told me, every time I'm in a traffic jam, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to get speeding tickets and lose my license. And he didn't use these words, but what he meant was his head told him, there are no IEDs in downtown Springfield. But that truth wasn't able to go down in his gut where that fear was to turn it off. I mean, there are millions of other examples. And again, to the 10th graders, I say, you're young, but some of you have had some grenades. And so you know what I'm talking about. Thunder, huge. Why not be vulnerable? Thunder, for me, was terrifying. When I was a curate at Grace Church in Manhattan, my apartment was on the 5th floor, and there were windows on 2 sides because it was the top apartment. And if there was a thunderstorm and I woke up at 2 a.m., what I was used to doing is turning on the lights, turning on the radio, sort of crawling in a fetal position and putting my fingers in my ears, and you can't really fall asleep that way. So what I would do is I'd get up, I'd take a little mattress from a rollaway cot, I'd take a pillow, I'd take a fan and an extension cord, go out of my apartment, get in the elevator, go down to the 3rd floor, get off to where the offices of the church were in the middle of the building, plug in the fan out in the hallway and go into the men's room, put the mattress down, and my head would be like underneath the door to the stall, but I could go to sleep because the sounds of the thunder were muffled. This is a grown man going to hide in a bathroom from thunder. The day that I discovered earplugs, it's sort of funny, but it was a miracle. I was visiting a paper mill in Maine, and they were handing out earplugs, which I hadn't even thought of. And suddenly my world was transformed because of those earplugs. I remember every spring I'd start to get this low-grade unconscious anxiety as I knew we were moving into thunder season. And I loved the fall when it was ending. Well, so let's talk about healing, okay? It's it won't be as long. Healing. First of all, there's this old adage that pain shared is pain halved, and it is true. For whatever PTSD any of us have got going, if you can find somebody where it's okay to take the risk of having it come out, a friend, a pastor, a shrink, for the price of a beer, the neighborhood bar is a great place because you can say whatever you want, and it's okay. So pain shared is pain halved. Now, it's terrifying often to do that. And you all know some people who went through all their lives, the last 55 years, not able to talk about it. And it stayed inside. Because time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it helps for somewhat. And of course, also, a lot of you know stories about World War II veterans. Flags of Our Fathers. If you read that about the 6 guys who raised the flag on Iwo Jima, 3 of them were later killed on Iwo Jima. The other 3 went home to go on a USO tour. 2 of them committed suicide, and only 1 was left, and he had a long, wonderful life somewhere in Minnesota. But when he died, his wife said that every night for 50 years he slept with the pillow under his, with a pistol under his pillow and woke up screaming. And he never talked about it. So there's so many stories like that. The second thing is, if you have had PTSD, find somebody else who's had the same experience. That's why AA is so powerful. So at an AA meeting, I can stand up and say, "Hi, my name is Jim. My wife hates me. I lost my job. My kids can't stand me. I'm living on the streets." And what do the people listening say? Do they say, "Oh my gosh"? No, they say, "Oh, hi, Jim." And the healing comes in part because my experience is being shared by others who know exactly what it's like. So I say to a 10th grader, let's just say that something bad is happening to you at home. If you've got a classmate who's also having something like that at home, getting together with that classmate provides some real healing. And when I say that, often after I'm done and the class is dismissed, there'll be students who will come up and they won't be revealing specifics, but they'll say, thank you that you were talking about me. The third and last thing that I'll say is God. And I got two stories. The first is that when I was in the hospital in Da Nang, let me back up. When I was in 29 Palms for 10 months, I worshiped at the base chapel. I sang in the choirs. Where's Sue? It was just ridiculous. And I got to know the chaplains. So then, fast forward about 5 or 6 months, 4 months, and I'm in the hospital ward, like the second or third day, and I've been praying, and nothing. I'm just terrified. And down the hall came one of the chaplains. The chances of that happening were 1 in 8 million. He saw me, and he came over, and we connected, and he said a prayer. And my experience of that was not that my fears went away. My experience was that God gave me a hand to hang onto in the storm, and that was enough. And here's the other thing. I'm sorry there's so many of you, because I'd love to use it as sermon illustration, but I can't now, but I'll tell you here. So about 10 years after Vietnam, I went to Africa. Bishop Stewart sent me along with, who? Ward Smith, the rector here. And Mary Lou LaValle. The three of us went with a group to East Africa. And the first night we landed in Nairobi, the capital of Kenya. And that evening we all went walking in Uhuru Park, which is Swahili for freedom. And no one told us that you're not supposed to walk in that park in the evening, kind of like Central Park in Manhattan. As we walked along, some Kenyan men jumped our group, and they pushed people to the ground, and they stole purses and wallets and cameras, and nobody was hurt really badly, but it was pretty unsettling. The next morning, I was walking with our group in downtown Nairobi on the sidewalk, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this fear just rose up inside of me. And it was so strong that someone had to take me into a building and just sit me down with my back to the wall. Oh, that's another thing. To this day, I forgot this. When I go to a movie theater, I really need to sit on the aisle. To be further in is to be kind of trapped. Even more examples are coming. Anyway, and as I sat there in that building in Nairobi, I slowly realized that what I was feeling was the fear that I'd felt in Vietnam. And I was stunned to think that I'd carried it here for like 10 years and didn't know it. And the trigger of the being jumped the night before had brought it all back with all the power as if Vietnam had just happened. So that afternoon, we were supposed to visit a church in the outsides of Nairobi. And we got into Land Rovers. And I made sure that I sat in the back seat with people on each side of me. I couldn't even look out the window. It felt like all of Africa was sort of crashing in on me. And we got to the church, and we got out and stood there. The church was ugly. I mean, it looked like sort of a concrete garage. But out of it walked the women's group, who had obviously been preparing for us. Maybe 15 or 20 women, and they were dressed in beautiful dresses, and they were dancing and singing and swaying, and they started to walk towards us. And I just stood there, still just kind of frozen in this fear. And as they got closer, one woman in particular started to walk toward me. And as she got closer and closer, I realized this was a very big woman. I mean, I'll bet she was 6'6", and she was not slender. And this was a significant woman. And she got closer and closer, and she got right up to me, and she put her arms around me. She totally invaded my personal space. And you remember the Marine Corps drill sergeant getting that close. And I kind of like disappeared out of sight in this woman's embrace. I couldn't describe exactly what it was like getting blown up by a grenade, I don't have the words to tell you what happened to me as that woman embraced me. All I can tell you is that as she held me, I felt the fear just kind of falling off me. I mean, the way leaves fall off the trees here in the fall. And to be replaced by a kind of peace which we Episcopalians call a peace that the world can neither give nor take away, the peace that passes human understanding. I later learned that she was one of 3 wives to a man, that she had had 16 children, she didn't speak any English, and that on an earthly level she and I have nothing in common, except that our hearts have been seized by the same God. So that I count her today as one of the wonderful gifts in my life. So my prayer really for all of us in whatever grenades we've experienced, that there might be arms like that for us. And that we might be arms like that for someone else. So here's the last story, and then we'll be done. And I think I may have already done this in a sermon. It's a story about that I'm told happened in Vietnam, although maybe it was World War II, of a firefight and of 2 Marines out in the open, and one of them gets shot and the other gets back under cover. And he's with his lieutenant, and he says to the lieutenant, "I want to go out and get my friend." And the lieutenant said, "No, you can't go, it's too dangerous." Then as the lieutenant has turned his back, the guy goes anyway. And he goes out and he gets to his friend and he picks him up and carries him back. But as he carries him back, he himself is wounded. And when he gets back and puts his friend down, he sees that his friend has died. And the lieutenant looks at him and says, "What a waste." And the guy looks at the lieutenant and says, "No, sir, it wasn't. Because when I got out there, my friend saw me. And he said, 'I knew you'd come.'" And so that's the last word that we all have. That there are those around us to whom we could always say, "I knew you'd come." And that we've got a God who, to whom we can say, "I knew you'd come at every moment, come what may." So it's past 8 and we should stop. But just for 1 second, anybody want to say a movie? Some war movie? Ask about it. Tell me whether you think it's real. Excuse me? Saving Private Ryan. Real or not real, do you think? It's a powerful, incredible movie. And in some ways, it's not real. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Any other movies?
The Longest Day.
What?
The Longest Day.
The Longest Day. Oh, I could not go to the first 15 minutes of that movie because I was told that it was so realistic, the landing at Omaha Beach. And powerful. Also, not realistic in one way. Any others? Huh? The Deer Hunter. Oh my gosh. The most incredible scene in The Deer Hunter is when the guy comes home from Vietnam, walks up to the front door of his house, sees the banner saying "Welcome Home," and turns around. He can't go in, and he goes to a motel for a couple of nights. Powerful, but in one way not realistic. Jerry.
The Thin Red Line.
Oh, golly. I mean, the same. Just amazing, but there's one thing that makes it not realistic. Anybody seen Full Metal Jacket? That's powerful. And the first half of it is boot camp, and it's realistic because the guy who's playing the drill instructor was a drill instructor in real life. Second half of the movie is the Battle of Hue in Vietnam. And at the end of the movie, as the credits are rolling, the Marines are walking across the battlefield and their bodies all around them, and they are singing a song. Anybody know what song they're singing? I'll sing it for you. M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. They are singing the theme song to the Mickey Mouse Club, and that is their statement of the significance of all of these bodies around them. And I point out Full Metal Jacket because that's the only music in the whole movie. So if you see a war movie, it may be really good and making great points, but if there's music, then it's telling you a lie. There was no orchestra playing background music that night when I got blown up in Vietnam. So the music is creating a mood. Maybe a great, great movie, but no.
Apocalypse Now?
Apocalypse Now. Oh my gosh, unbelievable. But talk about music. Oh, Flight of the Valkyries. Woo! Yeah, powerful. Yeah. Platoon. Do you remember the scene in Platoon where the helicopters come to rescue all the soldiers and they leave one guy behind by accident, and he's down there and he's got his arms open like this as his comrades are flying away, and behind him there are North Vietnamese soldiers approaching and shooting, and with his arms up there's this amazing music. I don't think he was hearing music at that point. Yeah, so.
A movie just came out over the Veterans Day weekend called, I think you'd find this interesting, it's called Fighting Spirit, A Combat Chaplain's Journey.
Wow.
And it's all about different chaplains. And
Yeah.
I don't know where it's playing or it's streaming, but
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, last one, Steve.
Band of Brothers.
Band of Brothers. I did not go see it, and I did not go see it on purpose because for some reason, the older I get, the harder it gets for me to actually see these movies with realistic killing. But I understand it's powerful. So, well, okay. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm honored to have the privilege of speaking to you. So, God bless you all.